Chief Washington correspondent Peter Cook has been crunching the numbers. And Peter, it could be a record breaker thanks to some really heated races in 7 spots.
That's exactly right. The fundraising frenzy, Betty, the campaign finance arms race, it continues even in this last week, so we don't have the final numbers at this point. But the Center for Responsive Politics already projects that this midterm could become the most expensive in history at more than $3.6 billion. That's not as much as we spent back in 2012 when, of course, we had a presidential race. The final tally there was $6.3 billion. But this updated projection, again, shows the total will likely be in the ballpark of the $3.6 billion spent in the last midterm in 2010, likely to exceed it, but perhaps not by much. And it's still light years, Betty, from the $1.6 billion spent back in the 1998 midterm. And, of course, the biggest change between then and now, the explosion of outside money, thanks in large part to the Citizens United decision. The candidates and parties this time around going to combine to spend $2.7 billion, but outside groups are going to kick in another $900 million, nearly $1 billion, $19.4 million a day in spending. Much of that spent just a handful of races.
They're very targeted, and looking at just the competitive races, their money in those close races may in fact be determinative.
Now, in the big picture here, the total money game, Republicans expected to outpace Republicans. If you tally it all up, the outside groups and, again, the parties and the candidates themselves, $1.92 billion spent on their behalf or attacking their opponents. Meanwhile, $1.76 billion for Democrats and their backers to be spent in this campaign. But remember, Betty, these totals don't capture everything. Spending by some outside groups doesn't have to be reported to the FEC, at least not at this point. So it's not reflected here at all. You can probably add another $100 million to the final total.
And which is the most expensive race so far, Peter?
Well, right now it's the Senate race in North Carolina that's outpacing everyone else. That's between the Democratic incumbent Kay Hagan, Republican Tom Chill. It's been a brutal battle down there and an expensive one as well. Almost $100 million has been spent on that race alone, and that includes a whopping $72 million by outside groups. That's a new record for a congressional race here. And again, a lot of this has been outside money. The Democratic Super PAC Senate Majority PAC, of course, pushing for Democrats to maintain the majority. They lead the way, more than $11 million spent basically on Hagan's behalf. And much of the outside money, Betty, again, has been spent to try and bring both of these candidates down. Tillis alone has had to overcome $31 million spent opposing him throughout this campaign. $18 million has been spent effectively trying to knock Hagan down. And again, Betty, it's got to remember, this doesn't capture all the outside spending against those two candidates. The groups that don't have to file with the SEC at this point don't show up in these numbers. The final numbers will be even higher than this.
And, you know, Peter, we were speaking about earlier this week about individual donors, and some from the GOP side and some from the Democrats. So who is the biggest individual spender in this election?
Betty, someone you're quite familiar with, has chatted with you several times. We don't have the final numbers, but right now it looks pretty clear that Tom STEYER, the hedge fund billionaire, is going to top the list. In all, he's given $73 million in the 2014 campaign cycle, and of that, $66 million has gone to his own super PAC, Next Gen Climate Action, largely backing Democratic candidates active on climate change issues across the country, although the group is still sitting on a whole lot of money, which raises some questions. He is the Sheldon Adelson of this cycle, unless, Betty, of course, someone steps in late in the game, which is always possible, to bump him from that top spot.
Well, as he said earlier this year, you know, he'll spend whatever it takes to win in those states.
He's putting his wallet where his mouth is. $73 million, Betty.
He is. And just quickly, Peter, before we go, what about businesses, the business lobbyists, or the corporations? What are they spending here in this campaign?
Well, they are spending. They're active. You know, you've got the Chamber of Commerce is in the top 4 in terms of all the outside spenders right now. You've got business groups that are trying to tilt the balance of power in the Senate, a lot of them supporting Republican candidates. Betty, what's important is a lot of this money is coming in late. This is the money that's going to decide some of these really close races. We don't know all those totals yet. This final week could make or break the election, and certainly could see the biggest package of spending altogether.
All right, Peter, thank you so much. Chief Washington correspondent Peter Cook.